Good morning. Welcome to everybody. I need two micros again. This is a weird way to speak. But I'm going to start asking. The organization is making things quite difficult because they joined two rooms, and now the room looks like much bigger than was yesterday. So I'm going to ask the people that is on the back, the shy sector, to go. I'm not asking to go to the first row, but come on, guys, come a little bit closer because it looks like there's people there. I cannot see your eyes. So at least to what it was the old New York room, which is a little bit closer. That might be nice of you. I mean it. Come a little bit closer. So the thing that I want to talk about today is precisely something related with people going very far, which is fear. So don't be afraid. I'm harmless. I wanted to do. I wanted to have some thoughts based on an anecdote that happened to me a few weeks ago. I received an email from a person that I didn't know. Well, it was a Facebook message of a person saying, "Why do you say that our scouting is fake scouting? You are being inconsistent with the scout law that says that scouts are brother to any other scout." Well, the context of this is that I wrote that book, on world scouting. And one of the things that I explained on the book is that we should know how to deal with associations that are not members of WSEC and WACS. So particularly because there are some associations that are called themselves scouts, but they don't want to share the values that are in scouting, which are values of inclusiveness, values of openness, values of independence. So what I said is we cannot call associations that are not following the principles of scouting non-recognized scout associations, but fake scout associations. But the question of this guy was important. He said, "Why you call us fake scouts? You are being inconsistent with the scout law." And if you ask this to a 10-year-old kid, he might say, well, maybe he's right. But then I went back to a big question in the 30s. Do you know, you probably know that in totalitarian regimes, they created youth movements that were indoctrinating young people. One of them, or the most well-known of them, was in the Nazi Germany and was called the Hitler Youth. And that was a movement that copied all the aesthetics of scouting up to the moment. So when you see the pictures of the Hitler Youth, that could remind some of the pictures that you saw 10 years before of scouting in many countries. Now, imagine for a second that the Nazi regime had the brilliant idea to call the Hitler Youth the Hitler Scouts. That could have been happened. I mean, who would have gone there saying, hey, you dropped the name? So we have a tension here on whether the name Scout is something that everybody can use and where are the limits on when this name is used for something that goes against our principles. I'm not saying certainly that the people that are very focused on traditional scouting, people that believe that if you don't wear uniform, you are not scout anymore, that if you do a particular ceremony, you are not scout anymore, that if you don't do or you don't wear a particular symbol, you are not scout anymore. I'm not saying that these people are people that are doing the same, that totalitarian regime youth movements. What I'm saying is that maybe when we discuss, like in this Congress, things related with education, we have to bear in mind that organizations, the way organizations work, are also ways of educating. The way we work, the way we interact in our organizations, say something on how we educate. So I'll try to talk a little bit about what we do not see. Something that the guy who sent me this message probably disagree, because he believed that scouting is what you could see, the symbols, the traditions, the ceremonies. I'm going to try to first talk a little bit about scouting as a movement. Is that too loose? The second thing I want to talk about is about the intuitive nature of scouting. Is that too weak for us? The third thing is dealing with challenging identities. Is this too insecure to us? And finally, I want to speak about empowered individuals. Are them too critical? So let me start with the movement thing. You probably know that the legend that one day Robert Baden-Powell seated in a table, took some notes, and decided to create the Scout movement is a legend. Because Scouting started a little bit by chance. So what happened was that Baden-Powell wrote this book, Scouting for Boys, after experiences, putting some things, etc. That was in 1908. It was published. It was very successful. Lots of copies sold. And in the United Kingdom, the editor of the book decided to do something that editors of these kinds of things sometimes do. For instance, if you know this American series called Star Trek, you know that the Star Trek fans sometimes they meet and they dress like the Star Trek characters. If you know the manga comics, you know that some followers of particular manga meet sometime and dress like the manga characters. So what happened in 1909 was precisely the same. It was a big gathering financed by the editor of Scouting for Boys of kids who read the book and started to act as the book was saying. And by the surprise of the organizers, it was a gathering of around 10,000 kids, boys and also girls, dressed in the way that the book explained. Not only dressed, but they were following the things that the manual was saying. The activities, the events they were doing with parents, with older brothers, with environments, etc. And it was then when the British promoters decided to create an organization, the Boy Scouts Association, and later on the Girl Guides Association. This is another story, why they were separated associations. The thing is that in very few years, the book was translated, very few years, I'm talking about 2, 3, 4 years, the book was translated to many languages, and many countries started to adapt Scouting, what existed in the United Kingdom, to their countries. In a way that in most countries, Scouting, people believe that the real Scouting is the Scouting that they have there. The real Scouting for people from Korea is the Scouting that they have in Korea. The real Scouting for people in Mexico is the Scouting that they do in Mexico. They know that there is Scouting everywhere, but Scouting is so rooted in probably most of your countries. Now, this gives us something very important, which is that Scouting as a movement started before Scouting became an organization. So this combination of Scouting being movement and being an organization gives Scouting a particular strength because you have the flexibility of the movement, but at the same time, you have the consistency of the organization. If you only have the movement, then one day you could have the Nazi regime calling themselves the Hitler Scouts, and you cannot say anything. Now, Scouting was formalized as a world organization in 1920, and since then, we have constitutional procedures to determine what is Scouting and what is not. When you try to explain to people from outside Scouting how Scouting is organized, people could think that it's hierarchical. So this is the image that many people have about Scouting. You have the World Organization, you have the National Association, you have the local groups, and this is something that when you see the model, the chief commissioner, the regional commissioner, the leader of the local group, this is what you feel. Now, the reality is that Scouting, organizationally speaking, operates this way. You have a guy that says, oh, I'm the chairman of the World Scout Committee. And the chairman of the World Scout Committee go to one of your local groups and say, hey, I'm the chairman of the World Scout Committee. And the local group is like, what are you talking about? I don't really know what you mean. So, and the same way in all the interactions, what you have is a movement that is very, very, very liquid. It works in this way. Although our names and many of the things that we imagine work in that way. So what you have is that we match on what is the academic definition of what a network, socially speaking, is. Manuel Castell says, in a network, the components, all of you, your groups, the associations, are both autonomous and dependent on the network, the big Scout network, and often share membership and goals with other networks, with other associations, with schools, with churches, with NGOs, etc. What explains why we work as a network, we have to go back to the unpaid participation of leaders. I think that this is fundamental. That is why it is impossible to ideologically control the groups. So the reason why, if the chairman of the World Scout Committee, or even the chief Scout Commissioner of your association go to a group and cannot tell the group to do something that goes against the values of the group, it's because the people of the group could say, whatever, I quit. And you have no tools to avoid that. So this is very relevant because it also impossibilitates to structure a system allowing guidelines to be implemented hierarchically. So this structure of this vertical structure that we saw before, this doesn't exist. If it existed, it would be very easy for an authoritarian regime to go control the Scout Association and say, now all the people of your association is going to do what we want. No, it cannot be done because suddenly they disappear. And also, that explains why, in cases of illegalization, like happening during the Second World War in many European countries or in other realities, even if the Scout organization is illegalized, even if the Scout organization disappears, the groups could go on because they don't need vitally this organization. Now, let me move to the intuitive nature. I feel that the strength of scouting is its outcome. So the message that this person sent me was a message saying, you cannot blame us to follow what Baden-Powell said in 1908. You cannot blame us to be faithful to the aims and the symbols that Baden-Powell gave us. But the strength of scouting is not on its symbols or in its ceremonies. It's in its outcome. And there is this study called the educational impact of scouting, which was a research that was done in 1997 by the World Scout Bureau. Well, it was commissioned to some researchers that gives this one of these conclusions. It says, the most powerful element in the construction of the young people's values, talking about kids between 14 and 18, appears to be personal experience and the meaning that he or she makes of the experiences, much of which takes place within the peer group itself. It is the climate of mutual respect and trust promoted by the leaders that facilitates the dialogue and the young people's attitude to express their views. So, on here, we could see that the construction of the young people values is on the experience. And for the experience, we don't need to go very far. It is exactly what happened when a kid who had never been scout joined a group and suddenly realized very fast what's the game of the group, what are the things. This is the experience, and this is the outcome. And here lies most of our potential. Now, this intuitive nature of scouting, this element that makes scouting to be rapidly grasped by a person who just entered into the movement, is both its best strength and its worst disadvantage. It is a strength because young people just join scouting because they have fun there. They find fun, they find friends, freedom, adventure. This is what they go to scouting for. But at the same time, that intuitive nature makes people from outside the scouting to feel that scouting is just leisure time activity. There is nothing else than kids playing. So when we go to a university professor, when we go to the principal of a school, when we go to a journalist and try to say scouting is relevant, scouting makes difference to people's lives, they say, I don't see that big difference between what you do and what many other people do. Take kids to the countryside and play with them. Now, the question is that the intuitive nature is not only something that gives us insecurity in front of the others. It also gives us insecurity inside our movement. Because when we feel that scouting should be something else than this thing that we feel, we go and click on traditions, on symbols, on things that we knew that scouting was when we were kids, things that we read in the books of the past, and we say, well, scouting must be this. If we lose this, we don't have scouting anymore. So maybe it's time to deal with identities, if identities are so important with us. The sense of identity can increase the strength and the warmth of our relations with others. We know that. the Scout identity is one of them. But we have many identities that makes us be empathic with the others. So, starting with your family. You may be related to your cousin, and maybe, I mean, you don't think that your cousin is the best person in the world, but it's your cousin. The extension could be also thought on religion. And if you are a Christian, you feel, well, I mean, the community of Christians, people who think the same that I do, or the community of Muslims, or the community of, you name it. And that also happened with compatriots. All the discourse about national identity, which is relatively new in history, it's something that comes from the 19th century, is related with the extension of your family. The people who had been born in your environment are your equals. So when you pay taxes, you know that those taxes are going to go to your equals. And then when you have immigration, they are not your equals, and you feel, oh, I don't know if I want my taxes to be devoted to the people that are not my equals. Or when a foreigner comes to your house, it's not the same that if your cousin comes and says, I need something to eat. So this sense of identity that creates this warmth with the others can also exclude the others, can also separate ours, so our friends, our family, our nationals, our fellow believers, to the others. Do you all know this Shakespeare play, Romeo and Juliet? So you remember that the others could be also when you talk about families and you have the Capulets. And if you are in my family, you are the best. If you are of the Capulets, you are of the worst. That could also be thought in religion. And you could say, oh, I'm very fond of my religion. But there are those ones that are infidels. They believe in things that are weird. They might be wrong. Because if they are not wrong, then it might mean that I'm wrong. So it's better to say that they are wrong and get rid of it. And it also happened with foreigners. We have our compatriots. We feel very fond of them. And we have the foreigners who are strange, eat weird food, dress in a weird way, use weird species, have weird habits, dress in a strange way, speak things that are totally incomprehensible. But we're in the Scout movement. And the interesting thing is that from its beginnings, the Scout movement had been an accommodator of multiple identities, and also a device to mitigate their excesses. So from the very beginning, Scouting had been dealing with national identity, with religious identity, even with gender identity, putting it there and saying, we don't want to avoid that. This is something that we have there, and this thing is something we have to deal with. Let me give you an anecdote that maybe you don't know. In the first World Jamboree in 1920, Baden-Powell was quite inspired by the Baron of Coubertin, who started the modern Olympic Games. So in the World Scout Jamboree of the UK, they introduced sort of Olympic Games for the kids. And they discovered suddenly that with these sport games, kids started to behave in a very nationalistic way, saying, oh, our country is the best. We beat you. We are the strongest. So they decided to get rid of sport games, and they changed them for cooperative games. So they started to think that they should work somehow with cooperative ways, because the tend of identities to be exclusionary is so big, is so powerful, that you are distracted for a second and you are already there. So the Scout movement deals with this and mitigates their excesses. You know, there is this concept of competing identities, which is very important. When you are a woman and you go to a country where the rights of the women are not similar to the rights of the men, you forget that they are foreigners and you identified with the women that are oppressed. That could also happen with your job. If you're a journalist and you go to a country when there is no freedom of speech, you feel much closer to the journalist that is being oppressed than the fact that they speak another language or that they're a distance of you. So competing identities means that we don't have just one identity. We have several identities. And if you could make them compete among them, you could mitigate the exclusionary vision of the ones who said everybody who is not Italian is totally unable to make good pasta. You say, well, my mom, who is from the Bronx, make very good pasta as well. So, as the Scout identity or the global identity, we use them in a way that complement all the others. So from the very beginning, we know that when we talk about our national loyalty, the loyalty to our country, or when we talk about our beliefs or the relation to the religion that we profess, all of this has always one limit. We are a world organization, we have sense of global belonging, and that means that no nation is better than another, no religion is better than another. And this, that seems very common sense, is fundamental to limit the exclusionary tendency of many of these identities that you probably have been experienced in your own place. And this is precisely why local groups need this sense of global belonging. This is why the international education is nuclear for Scouting, because that mitigates the temptation of exclusionary identity and allow them to educate in global citizenship. Now, identities are human constructs. People who imagine that their identity, their religion, the name of the country, the flag, was there since the beginning of times know that this is wrong. All our languages started one day, or our country started one day, and probably everything is going to change one day or another in years, or in centuries, or in millenniums, whatever. So the view of culture as something static, imposed, homogeneous, unitary, is false. You just have to go back to your country, your language. You go 300, 200, 100 years back, and you know that things were different, that some foods were different, that some music was different, that even some words were different. So what happened is that in identities, intransigence, this exclusionary tendency, is the consequence of fear of change. We have fear of change. I have a little philosophical thought on that. I think that the fear of change related with identities is a little bit related with the fear of our own death. When things change, the things that we've seen always there, our language, the houses in our neighborhood, the way people behave, the colors, the smells, when all of this change, we die a little bit. And we have fear of that. We cannot go back. And we are like, we are losing things. And if I'm losing things, I'm a little bit less what I used to be. So we have this fear. And this fear could have as a reaction intransigence, saying, I don't want the ones that make me change. I don't want the ones that put a different music in my neighborhood. I don't want the ones that speak another language, have another color, do things that are different. I don't want the ones that pray in the street instead of in the church. Or I don't want the ones who have a cross instead of having a star. I don't want the ones that just existing show me that my reality has changed. So the fear of change is common to all identities. national ones, religious ones, and also association ones, because our associations are also cultures. So when identities, whereas identities give us sense of security, the language, the food, the flag, colors, religions, traditions, in associations happen the same. Our uniform, our emblem, our ceremonies, our routines, all of that give us security. And we say, oh, I'm now more secure. I know that this is scouting. So facing the growing diversity in societies, facing new forms of understanding spirituality, fear comes and takes us back to authenticity, the thing that is real. And this happened in national identities, this happened in religious identities, and it also happens with Scout identity. Let me give you those two examples that are not from now, a little bit, are like for 40, 50 years ago. So in 1966, the United Kingdom Scout Association did a process called the Advanced Party Report, changing things related with the method, with the educational structure, with the symbology, with the uniforms. And the consequence of this big change that was very important was that some people of the association said, this is not scouting anymore. We are losing what we were. If Baden-Powell was here, would say that you are betraying the movement. And they left and created something using the name Scouting and saying, we are the real Scouts. And they used the name of Baden-Powell saying, we are the one, we are the sons, the real sons of Baden-Powell. No, these people that are changing, forgetting what Baden-Powell said. And something similar happened with religious organizations. So I believe it was in the 60s or the 70s, but it was stronger in the 80s and 90s. The very conservative Catholic groups said what Scouting is doing is not enough for our church. We must use Scouting as a tool to directly indoctrinate kids to know that the Christian religion and the Catholic religion is the true one. And if you have the true one, you don't want to go with the ones that are mistaken and that believe things that are wrong. You go to them and say, sorry guys, you are wrong. Because we've been told that we are the ones that are right. So they created something called Scout d'Europe to preach that they are right. They had been told what the real religion is, and they cannot be in an organization where people that have other beliefs could challenge them. So, that said, it is important in associations to differentiate when unity faces the intolerance of those who live, because they do not allow consensual changes and updates. Or when unity is at risk because the association's culture prevents any debate or dissent for fear. And we know that this is something that also happens in many of our associations, in the World Organization. We say, oh, this is something that we cannot discuss. It has always been like this, and it's going to be like this forever and ever. This is something that cannot be discussed. If we change this, we are not going to be Scouts anymore. And it's interesting because you probably know this text, this conference that Baden-Powell delivered in 1922 in the first Congress of Moral Education that wasn't published a few years ago under the name Education in Love in Place of Fear. He said, after all, when you come to consider it, It is fear that dominates our policies in every country in the world. It is not the abolition of armies that will do away with war anymore than the abolition of police will do away with crime. We have to do away with the cause of war. Armies are rather the effect. The cause, or the war, is the result of fear and of the fighting spirit. And that is the matter for education. So, how could we resist the inclination to fear? How could we beat insecurity? How could we avoid perpetuating that fear through our education? Well, let's talk a little bit about something that we're supposed to do, which is empowering individuals. We want to empower young people because we believe that young people are the best actors of their own development. We believe that young people are, when we give them responsibility, they are the best self-educators. They grow. As the report on the educational impact of scouting shown us, their experience is what make them great. So let me remind you the purpose of the movement. The purpose of the Scout movement is to contribute to the self-development of young people in achieving their full physical, intellectual, social, and spiritual potentials as individuals, as responsible citizens, and as members of their local, national, and international communities. So, we contribute because the development is self-development. They develop themselves in achieve their potentials as individuals and as citizens, members of their communities. Well, what that means is that the goal of scouting is the education of individuals and not the direct transformation of society. So when we say creating a better world, we don't come here and organize how to create the better world. We have shared values and we empower young people for them to be the actors. So that means that scouting does not attempt to establish a particular vision for how society should be, but to shape responsible citizens with inclusive values, which are the values that we all share, for them to participate in the definition of their model society and contributing to make it possible. And this is what I call leadership for change. When we talk about leadership, we are talking about empowering individuals. We are talking about giving them shared values and saying, I believe that you could make change. And when people say, oh, I'm not able to create a vision, I say, this is not true. Because every time that you say, this is wrong, you are envisioning how society should be. So leadership entails empowering young people to paddle their own canoe, in words of Baden-Powell, providing them with skills, confidence, and opportunities to take their own decisions. Let me go back again to this report on the educational impact of scouting. It says, young scouts unconsciously distinguish between their inclusive scout values and the exclusionary values that they face in their day-to-day. So the adolescents of the study critically extract the currents of the suggested values with the practices. If the shared values are internalized, they become critical within current practices, even if they come from the scout leader. So that means that when you clearly state the shared values, which are the values of our law, the scout leader is clearly filtered with his incurrencies. And the kids know it, and the kids realize it, and say, whatever. You say whatever you want, you are not being a good scout because you are not following the values that we share. Therefore, Scouting's education outcome makes young people to intuitively apply their critical judgment when they face exclusionary values promoted by those interpreting the identities. And this is something very important, because the most relevant thing of identities is who interpret them. And you know this of many examples. People who say a good French is, people who say a good Muslim is, people who say a good Scout is. The interpreters of identities are the ones who have the power to control society. And what we are telling our kids is, you have value, inclusive values, you use these values and go to the world and say that there is nothing that you cannot decide for the future. So our young people could see, instead of what a good French is, the duties of a citizen in the diverse society. They could see, instead of what a good Muslim is, the consistency of your actions and your thoughts with the message of love or your beliefs. And they could contrast what a good Scout is with the currents of the day-to-day behavior of a Scout. And I go back again to another text that I like a lot of Baden-Powell to stress the fundamental role of critical thinking. He wrote in 1922, "Justice and fair play do not always form part of our school curriculum. If our lads were trained as a regular habit to see the other fellow's point of view before passing their own judgment on a dispute, what a difference it would at once make in their manliness of character. Such lads would not be carried away, as it is at present too commonly the case, by the first orator who catches their ear on any subject, the interpreters of identity. But they would also go and hear what the other side has to say about it, and would then think out the question and make up their own minds as men for themselves. And so it is in almost every problem of life. Individual power of judgment is essential, whether in choice of politics, religion, profession, or sport." And Baden-Powell said, "Half of our failures and 3/4 of our only partial successes among our sons is due to the want of it. We want our men to be men, not sheep." So the empowerment of individuals with critical judgment, it's the total opposite of indoctrination, and it's the main tool of the transforming educational action of Scouting. Building responsible and committed citizens acting accordingly with their values. Without critical thinking, leadership cannot exist. Leaders cannot be just followers of others' commands. In Scouting, we learn how to both follow directions and direct ourselves. And this is a balance. And this balance has an outcome. People who are able to have critical thinking, not to just passively do what the others say that they should do. So that means that we should empower our youth. This means that we should empower our youth to be critical and to be open to what is called cultural dissent. Cultural dissent is a concept that I borrowed by Madhavi Sander, a professor at the University of California. And she says that it's the challenge by individuals within a community to modernize or broaden the traditional terms of cultural membership. So, said in another way, it is the right to dissent from traditional cultural norms and to make new cultural meaning. And that applies to the national identity, it applies to the religious identity, it applies to the Scout identity. A cultural descent approach recognizes that cultures are changing, in some ways for better, and facilitates a normative vision of identity in which individuals can choose among many ways of living within a culture. So this approach says that there is no one who has been born without the right to redefine all the elements of identity that he or she is going to have in the years of his or her life. So, to be open to cultural dissent gives individuals more freedom to make the world, which is precisely what we expect from our Scouts. Individuals shaped with inclusive values of coexistence, educated in love in place of fear, committed to creating a better world, equipped by leadership skills, with leadership skills and open minds to make that vision possible. And I think that with this, I'm going to finish. Many thanks. Now, I think that we still have 45 minutes to share thoughts, reactions, controversies, whatever you want. But you'll have to take 2 micros like me to allow diversity to be possible a little bit more in the room. So who would like to break the ice? You could either sit here or come here, whatever you feel better.
Bon, merci, j'appelle au secours. Merci, je remercie l'orateur pour...
Un moment. Je pense que... Aya? D'accord.
D'accord. Je remercie l'orateur pour la clarté de sa présentation. D'abord, je commence par l'idée de scoutisme authentique, le bon scoutisme. C'est un conflit qui existe dans nos associations. Et après l'introduction de la nouvelle politique de gestion des ressources adultes, après le vote de la politique de développement du programme des jeunes, il y a eu des résistances, il faut le reconnaître. Mais puisque nous sommes liés nous sommes d'abord dans le domaine de l'éducation, nous sommes liés par les principes fondamentaux, dont la méthode scout, nous pensons quand même qu'il y a quelque chose à préserver. Je ne suis pas pour le conservatisme, il faut l'innovation, il faut être ouvert à l'innovation pour pouvoir avancer. Mais dans le domaine de l'éducation, nous devons prendre des précautions parce qu'en dehors de l'école, les gens ne croient pas que nous soyons des acteurs de l'éducation. Et il y a une communication à faire autour. C'est le premier point. Je ne sais pas s'il faut continuer ou bien.
First of all, thank you very much for your speech. That was pretty clear to us, or at least to me. And I recognize that there is certain issues with regards to the difference versus or between scouting and true scouting. In my country, we had we've renewed recently the program, and we had to face some difficulties because some people did not want to lose the true, what they call the true values of scouting. Now, I think that we still, nonetheless, need to pay attention not to completely get loose of all the traditional values, because in terms of education, for example, there's still older methods that are still valuable.
Le deuxième point que je voudrais aborder, c'est là où l'orateur a parlé d'Olympiade ou de Jeux olympiques pour le scoutisme. Parce que Et ça faisait ressortir les identités nationales. On a dû laisser cette forme d'activité. La question que je voudrais me poser, est-ce que ce n'est pas une fuite en avant, puisque nous voulons préparer les jeunes à affronter les réalités de la vie, à travailler, à être responsables dans leur société. On continue d'organiser les Jeux olympiques, on continue d'organiser les championnats internationaux entre pays. Pourquoi ne pas utiliser cette occasion pour préparer davantage ceux-là à faire face à ces... Parce que nous ne sommes pas seuls et nous n'avons pas le pouvoir d'empêcher l'organisation de ces activités-là. Est-ce qu'on ne pouvait pas continuer et voir dans quelle mesure contribuer à améliorer ces rencontres?
And I have a second comment about the Scout Olympic Games that you mentioned. So you mentioned that originally there used to be Olympic Games, but that we stopped doing that in order not to exacerbate the national trends and the competition between the nationalities. I think that we might be actually flying away from potential issues. Why are we not actually tackling the issue instead of flying away from these issues? When I see in the real world, there are Olympic Games. And so if different countries manage to create Olympic Games, how come we in Scouting are not able to do that?
Le dernier point, ça concerne le leadership. Nous savons que la démarche qui nous est proposée à travers le développement du programme, à travers notre méthode, c'est d'aider les jeunes à développer leur potentialité et en devenant responsable en faisant. C'est-à-dire que le responsable qui encadre les jeunes, il doit savoir pourquoi il fait les activités avec eux. Dans le domaine physique, quand on dit le jeune doit pouvoir coordonner, il doit pouvoir diriger pour son développement social. Ça voudra dire qu'au cours des activités, il faut que ce soit les jeunes qui jouent les rôles principaux, non pas les adultes à leur place. C'est ce qu'on nous a reproché dans beaucoup de projets où les jeunes sont utilisés comme de la main-d'œuvre facile. Alors, cela appelle de la part du chef d'unité, de l'encadreur, des compétences. Voilà que ce n'est pas des professionnels, c'est des volontaires. Quelle exigence nous pouvons avoir de ceux-là? Est-ce que ça ne demande pas de plus en plus des gens compétents pour pouvoir encadrer les jeunes? Quelle évaluation nous pouvons faire? À quel niveau de rigueur on peut avoir vis-à-vis de ces volontaires-là? Est-ce que ça ne pose pas la question de la qualité des volontaires qu'il faut au scoutisme? Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas nécessité de faire un débat là-dessus? Merci.
And the last question is, I would also like to mention leadership. We know how leadership is important. Our leaders learn to be leaders by doing, so they also learn by doing. This being said, I think that our leaders need to be skilled to use the Scout methods, but nonetheless they are volunteers. So I would like to ask you the question about how can we measure the quality of our leaders so that we're sure that our leaders are skilled to use the Scout method.
Well, the debate about what to preserve is the traditional one, and we will always have it. And basically, this is what we have everywhere. If we change this word, if in French we allow some English words, are we losing what French is? If we start using curry in our food, are we losing what our food was? If we introduce something new and replace this new for something that is old, are we losing what we were? And I think that we should be a little bit more strong on our security of what scouting is and how scouting works. Because we have a very well-established system with an educational method that is plural and work together with several elements. We have a good definition that allows us to see that if a Scout association is controlled from the outside, cannot be a Scout association. We have a good purpose that says we want to empower individuals. If we indoctrinate them, this is not Scouting. We empower individuals. If you work with the mass, this is not Scouting. We envision citizens to create a better world based on Scout values. If we tell them how society should be, this is not Scouting. So we have something that is quite strong. And the interesting thing is that we could take this strong thing to be light. I don't know how many of you do, I don't know how you call it in English. ¿Cómo es diu escalada en inglés? Climbing. So this thing that you have to go and take with a cord. And you suddenly, if you fall, you get taken by the cord, right? So there is a great combination here. You should be very light, but you have a strong security. It doesn't make sense if you are with fear on the wall, because you are already secure. So we have to think a little bit like if we were climbing like this. We have a good security. We have a strong educational basis. We have strong value system. And then we have to give a little bit of lightness there. Because if we don't have lightness there, we cannot climb. We have to be a little bit more secure. And let me jump to your third question about leadership. Have to be a little bit more secure of what Baden-Powell said. Not because he said it, because he proved it. That if you give responsibility to young people, they take this responsibility and use it in a good way. If you don't believe that young people could be empowered, forget it. There is no system. There is no security. You could do whatever you want. You could do tests. You could do badges. You could do exams. You could make proofs. All of this is going to be useless if you don't believe that young people have the capacity to transform themselves and be fulfilled individuals and committed citizens. So the way to prove if our leaders are able to empower these young people is as simple as to tell them, ask the kids. To tell them, be an older brother and not a teacher or not a preacher. So this is the crazy thing. We have a method that is so simple and so evident that we wake up in the morning and we say, there is something wrong. There is something wrong. It must be something else. We need something more structured. And when we do this structure thing, the more we structure the things, the more we structure the training, the more we're structuring the progressive system, the less light our educational process is. And we are climbing. We already have the cord. We don't need all this weight. We have already a system that works. And just a little thing related with the identity thing. We already interact with national identity and with religious identities, and we do it in many ways. The reason why Baden-Powell decided not to use anymore the Olympic competition is because it awakened the worst part of the identity, which is the exclusionary thing, the feeling that you could beat the other, that you are the good and the other is the bad. If I win, the others are idiots. If I lose, the other are bastards. So there is never a possibility for me to be in peace with the others. So he said, this is not the thing. We have to find other kinds of things. And I think that when you go to an international event, we see that probably the things that we use now are much better, not to make people to start acting as hooligans. There is one there and one here.
Thank you very much, Eduard, for this very insightful talk, for the research of the book. I can personally say it. I've been reading the book. I've been discovering a lot of scouting and reflecting a lot as well on one main quote that a very close friend from scouting once told me. He said, in scouting, our tradition is innovation. And we need to reflect on a second part of this sentence, which is, for how long? For how long? Because I believe as well that scouting is what we don't see. Nonetheless, perhaps a couple of decades ago, it was very difficult for companies to find the secret of a new medicine or the secret of building a car. And it was well kept, and it was difficult to replicate, and it was difficult to improve. The United States car industry believed that their only competition were American car companies. They paid very little attention to what was happening in Japan. Nowadays, I think they would have thought another way if they knew how the scenario was to be like as today, no? Nowadays, we're seeing formal education turning and saying, hey, non-formal education has very important things that we need to incorporate in our system. There's going to be huge investments, intellectually, academically, financially, on the competence model, on learning by doing, and all these things. So scouting will face new competitors in a very short future, and it is today as well in many countries. It will not be long, a lot of time to pass when many people around, without being scouts or going through the scout training, really can be able not only to replicate but also, or imitate, but also to improve and innovate based on new trends and everything. So what is the recommendation? What is, how can scouting prepare to keep its tradition being innovation? Building, and I think that in your book you very precisely identified, which is education for global citizenship, the global dimension of scouting, the network. What is called in kind of some methodologies of assessment, the strategic asymmetries that differentiate us from our competitors, from the other environment. And I think we can find these asymmetries here. Nonetheless, as scouting started very much by chance, I think many of these consequences have occurred by chance as well. Not because we had a deliberate analysis of the tools we wanted to give the scout leaders so that they can promote and strengthen these ideals. But what I think is that we have a very few time left until this chance and this by consequence thing cannot be easily perhaps replicated by an education ministry, and then just saying, well, and losing an opportunity. So what is your reflection after all this research on how could scouting prepare on building upon its strengths to keep its relevance? Thank you.
Thanks. We have one there and one here. Let me just go for a second on this. I like a lot this wording of the purpose. Not because the one who wrote it was a poet, but because I think that it's a good summary of what we want. So, what is the purpose of a car company? Well, to sell cars. What is the purpose of a company, not of a car company? To earn money, to make money. So the purpose of a car company is to make cars. But if for some reason the cars market disappear, the last purpose of the company is going to be make money. And that is why some companies have totally changed, and from dealing with wood, they moved to dealing with telephones, with cell phones. So what is our purpose? And I think that this is quite nice written. First, we want to contribute to self-development of young people. We contribute so we are not the ones. And we believe in self-development. So we want to help them to grow. And when we self-development, what we think is that they have a potential, an endless potential. And we say, well, this potential, spiritual, social, intellectual, and physical, they could achieve it by themselves. And we could help them to do that. And we do that as individuals and responsible citizens of their local, national, and international communities. So it's not just, when I say global citizens, I'm talking also the citizens of their village, of their country. This is complementary. It's not exclusionary. This is our purpose. So all the rest of the things are related with the purpose. Because if the purpose is of a car company is selling cars, everything is related with that. One day it's going to start making, I don't know, trucks or ships or boats. So what we have is a good pedagogical, educational method to achieve this. And the thing is that we know that the method works. And sometimes we start doubting whether this works or not. And we do lots of documents and we modify things. And sometimes we realize that young people today is different than young people 50 years ago. And we say, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe the groups, the age groups are different. Or maybe my country doesn't work the same that in the other countries, so the age group should be different. Or maybe the small groups things work better here than there. So we modify things and we adapt it. And sometimes we're successful and sometimes we are not. But we still are trying to fulfill this. If we forget our purpose, there is nothing to do. If a car company forget that the purpose is to sell cars, everything else is a joke. So if we have our purpose clear, all the other things follow. We have a very strong method. We have an educational system that, as yesterday we were explaining with Dominique Bernard, follow what cognitive science says, the appetite for learning of young people. We have this works, let's follow it. When we start to fear that this is too weak, is when we lose, is when we don't have the capacity to do. So innovate until when? As a car company does. The advantage that we have is that it could be a day that no one wants to have a car. And then your final goal is not going to be selling cars, it's going to be earning money. But the only way that this purpose is not relevant anymore is the day that there are no more human beings. So this is good news for us, at least. Because it seems that we're going to have some kind of work to do for at least the existence of the humanity. Now, why we are so worried with governments or schools doing things that are similar of the things that we do? If our purpose is this one, we should be happy. If they do things that we also do, we should be happy. We should innovate, complementing and saying, well, if they do this, I could do another thing. If in school they are more entitled to have initiative and to have self-development, much better for us. Let's focus a little bit more on other things. So the idea that we are competing with formal education is crazy. Our goal is this one. We want to empower them. We believe that they could achieve their potentials by themselves. So everything that moves around us that goes in that direction is good. And we should say, great. And we should innovate both to have more people on this, to have more people that are self-empowered, more people that could achieve their potential, No more numbers by the sake of it. No more numbers to say, oh, we look at us, we have more millions. And then discover that these millions are not being empowered, are not being self-fulfilled. Have always in mind the purpose, and then put innovation in anything that makes the purpose up to date in your country, in your village, in your reality, or in the reality of the kids that today are born when in 80-year times they are old people talking about what scouting used to be. Yeah, I think that first were the friend from Madagascar, then here.
Thank you for another very good presentation. Values are part of our identity. Actually, they are the basis of our identity. If we are not to fear to lose our identity, where and how do we draw a line? Where and how do we draw the line?
Well, the line cannot be drawn. And this is why fear appears. Because if we had already a recipe on where the line is, we would be very secure and say, oh, I have no worries. But the line is not there. And we have to follow a little bit our intuition as well, as our kids do when we empower them. And go back and say, why do we exist? Do we exist for that? Okay, we know something. What is the purpose of our values? To create a framework of coexistence for our kids to know what this better world should be? Well, this is something. Now, is the uniform the key element for this? Is the scarf? Is the fleur-de-lis? Is the hat? Is the ceremony? Is the promise? Is the badge? Is this kind of award that we give? Is the Eagle Scout program? Is this particularly something that if we lose it, we are not going to be scouts anymore? Well, go back to that. Because the funny thing is that people with fear to lose authenticity always quote Baden-Powell. And when you see the evolution of Baden-Powell between 1908 and 1920, 1925, it's huge. He made lots of change. He took Scouting for Boys. Every edition had changes. He introduced new things. He said in the first edition of Scouting for Boys, 1908, says, you belong to the British Empire, which is probably the most relevant empire that have never existed in the world. The edition of 1915, 1918 of Scouting for Boys doesn't speak about the greatest empire in the world anymore. And with these, many other things related with race, with colony, with women, with Cub Scouts. Another good example. Cub Scouts were not at the beginning of Scouting. They thought that Cub Scouts were too little to have the experience of Scouting. And they were introduced. So there are many things that are related with the goal. And the goal, the purpose is this one. So this is where the fear appears and when we should be courageous. To be able not to take the fear and say, okay, because I don't know where the line is, let's not change anything. And when someone comes to my association and says, hey, why are we doing this? And my reaction is saying, because this is how it has always been done. Wrong. This is bad. We are reacting with fear. We have no idea why this is like this. But because we don't know if the alternative is going to be better or worse, we say, well, let's keep it that way. So I'm not saying that Scouting should be changing every day. What I'm saying is that we cannot be afraid of change. And particularly that in our associations, many times, we theoretically talk about empowering individuals, and then we think that young people should grow to have something to say. And it's absurd. When we talk about the Educational Congress, the organizers told me, oh, remember that we are talking about education outcomes, not organization outcomes. And this is true. But the way we organize ourselves is also a message of our education. When I was international commissioner, I was 24. And I remember that Europe region started to talk about youth empowerment and youth participation. And it was the time that it was organized the first World Scout Youth Forum. And I went to the youth forum that was few days before the World Conference, but I was international commissioner. And in the youth forum, I found several venture scouts who had no idea whatsoever what we were talking about on the forum, because they were sent there to discuss about your things. They were not empowered. They had no information what the forum was about. So people started to talk about whatever. And then when I went to the Scout conference, I realized that the other people said, oh, it's good to have the young people there discussing things. We empower them. No, that's not empowering them. What we are saying is, young people, you play there, and here we all people, we are the ones who know what are the important things. We are going to decide for you. 2 years ago, Karin Albach was elected member of the World Scout Committee, and I believe that she had been the youngest member of the World Scout Committee since then. And I have been in several moments during these 2 years of Karin meeting people that didn't know her, people who had been in the movement before. The reaction has always been, oh, it's good that the young lady is in the committee. Things are changing. It's good that you young are there. No one believes that she is much smarter than many people that I've seen in these last 20 years in the World Scout Committee. They just think that she's a young lady. And it's like when you put a little bit of green next to your meat to put some color there. Well, if we don't believe that young people have capacity to do things in our association, we cannot make the change. And a way, answering your question, a way also to not have this fear of change is to interact with people who had been born after us, and so they see the world in a different way that you've seen it.
I want to say thank you that I got opportunity to be in this session. I'm from Uganda, and you rightly said that scouting is what we do not see. I then want to ask, do we understand it rightly? Since we do not see it. Probably the problem could be, since we do not see it, then many who are in it also do not understand it rightly.
Thanks for that. I think last spring, I was invited by an Italian association to a congress, and they asked me to talk about the public irrelevance of scouting. They say, we go around and people say that we are irrelevant. And I discussed a little bit this idea of the intuitive nature of scouting. So, well, the interesting thing is that we are obsessed with physical things that give us security, but we realize that the only people that truly understand scouting are people who had been in scout experiences. So it's like a paradox, right? We feel that our security comes from physical things, but we know that these physical things are unable to explain outside our world what scouting is. The only thing that explains what scouting is the experience that individuals have. And when they go out and say, scouting had been totally nuclear in my life, in my professional life, in my identity as a man or as a woman, in my profession, in my beliefs, when I've been CEO of my company, when I've been mayor of my city, or when I've been chairman of a local NGO. And we know that because they say that. And no one needs them to show the physical things. But then we go back to the physical things. So I think that we don't, your idea of the doubts about our understanding, I believe that all of us, all the people in this room, understands the experiences that we had when we were in our local group. We all know which experiences we had. The problem is that later on, when we tried to explain it, we started to have problems. And we said, well, let me see. And I start to put examples instead of saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the people from outside say, you scouts are like a sect. You speak all in the same way. And you say things and you behave in a way that is weird. And we don't know how to answer. And basically, it's because we are an experiential movement. Our educational action is based on experience. So it's very difficult to transform this experience into something that could be written. And this insecurity doesn't mean that we don't know what scouting is. I believe that we do know what scouting is, but we are afraid that we are wrong. We say, well, yeah, that was what happened in my group, but that's probably not properly scouting because there are some other elements. So let me read something. Let me go to some document. Let me see some other things. And I remember when we did the preparation of the meeting of preparation of this Congress, I asked about the dress code. How should I dress? I'm not in my association anymore, so they say, well, but you also could use, if you want, the uniform of your association. And I said, well, my association don't use uniform. And the question was like, oh, but is it the Scout Association? So, well, I believe so. But in Catalan Scouting, most people don't use uniform. And in my particular association, there is no one using uniform. Uniform disappeared in the early 80s. But I believe that is a Scout Association. It follows this purpose. It has the same method. It shares the same values. It belongs to a world movement. So that means that the association is less Scout. We had the same debate when a couple of months ago, the UK Scouting modified the promise to allow people that were not God believers to join Scouting. Is Scouting less Scouting? Could we say that UK Scouting is still Scouting? Well, in 1920, Baden-Powell, when the World Organization of the Scout Movement was constituted, accepted the presence of the Éclaireurs de France, which was a laïc association. And Éclaireurs de France had been in Scouting since 1920. Now, could we say that they do Scouting, but what they do is not Scouting? This is a little bit contradictory, right? So what we mean is that to separate the things that are nuclear of what Scouting is, which is, for instance, the spiritual dimension. So to know that we want to empower our kids also with the elements that make the material things less valuable than the spiritual things. So that our most important contributions is in an era where the important things are the physical things and the value that we give them, the monetary value, how this computer, how much is this computer, how much is my cell phone, how much is this shirt. We in scouting give things that are that have no monetary value, which is the effort, the time that we spend, the friendship, the love, the struggle. When we do this, we are doing spiritual development. If we need to put some kind of symbology on it, and we just keep the symbology and forget all of that, is when we are starting to feel that we are more secure, but we are losing what scouting is properly. I don't know if I'm being too long with my answers. I'm starting to doubt that. Sorry for that.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Vallory, I really appreciate your wonderful, presentations entitled "Scouting is What We Don't See." What I want to say is that in Taiwan, we almost have a department of scouting education. And I am the guys depending on teaching scouting education in Taiwan. And so I will say, repeat what I have in my presentation. We have scouting educations in Taiwan, but it used to be an independent course. But now it is only a part of so-called integrated activities. Scouting education, no name in our country, but I will say it's still there substantially, just like what you say. Say if you don't have a uniform, you are still doing scouting. So my conclusion is that don't be afraid of the change. Now we have, in Taiwan, we have almost scouting education as a middle school course for about 70 years. But, you know, now we have changed. So I will say again, there's a doctor dissertation in 1980 in South Africa. It's a dissertation called The Educational Philosophy of Baden-Powell. It's a wonderful dissertation. Okay, you guys maybe want to read it. Okay, so to me, scouting is an educational matter. It's a form of progressive education, but few people know that very well. So to me, it's very interesting. This is the first Congress on scouting education, and I think it's right. But I'm a little bit confused that why the topic is education for life, but not global citizenship education. I think idea of the citizenship education in scouting is still very, very, very important, because that's will help us to see the whole world as one. But why education for life? But it's, to me, we have life education, concept of life education in our country, and I'm doing research on that already. So to me, better says, scouting is still a good vehicle for helping people to become an individual, but also as a global citizen. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just wrap up because it's already time, saying two things. One, I'm trying to look it here, but it's too difficult. I'm not going to do it. I was going to find a quote also by this document that was edited 5 or 7 years ago called Education in Love Instead of in Place of Fear, which is the speech of Baden-Powell in 1922. And he says something like this. I'm going to quote by memory. He says, the badges, the uniforms, the stories of the Zulus, the dresses, all these things are things that kids love. And we use them to giving them, he says, the pill of education. So we use that because they like to play with this kind of things. So he knew that the purpose was this individual empowerment. And that was a good means. If that works, let's use it. If it doesn't work anymore, let's find another thing. That's not the main issue. So let me wrap up with something as well on the reflection on Scout and school. Again, there is the thing of fear. If our purpose is clear, it's good that in other environments, people do things that are closer and closer with Scouting. There is only one danger. The danger, and I'm not reacting on fear with this, the danger is that we could imagine that this substitutes what we do. So the problem with education, with Scouting in school, or with Scouting in universities, or with governments creating departments related with Scouting, is not that they do things similar of what we do, but that doing that, we stop doing what we were doing. So Scouting is not made to be taught in a classroom. Scouting is not made to be hierarchically organized. You could use many things of Scouting to do that. And if this is useful, go for it. But that doesn't mean that you should stop doing what Scouting is meant to do, which is giving young people the capacity for themselves in a framework of shared values to fully develop their potentials and to be fulfilled individuals and good citizens. And I think that if there is nothing strong to say, we should stop here. Thank you.